The first complaint about the ducks sounded like a joke. It came in the form of an email from the HOA, sent to everyone in the neighborhood, with a subject line that made it seem like something serious was about to follow. Community notice, wildlife disruption issue. That alone should have been a clue, because nothing good ever comes from someone labeling wildlife as a disruption. I opened it expecting something minor, maybe noise, maybe a one-time issue. Instead, it was about ducks. 14 of them. Living near the small pond at the edge of the neighborhood. The same pond that had been there long before the houses were built. The same pond that was literally part of why half the people here bought their homes. And apparently, now a problem. The email described them as excessive, unsanitary, and negatively impacting community standards. That last part stood out, because standards usually apply to people, not ducks. I didn't think much of it at first. Most people didn't. Because ducks at a pond isn't unusual. It's expected, normal, the kind of thing that makes a place feel less artificial. But then came the second email. More detailed, more specific. And this time, signed directly by the HOA president. That's when it stopped feeling like a general notice and started feeling personal. She had clearly taken an interest in the situation, and not in a casual way, in a determined one. The kind where someone decides something needs to be fixed, even if it was never broken. According to her, the ducks were creating ongoing issues that required immediate action. No explanation of what those issues actually were, just the conclusion, and more importantly, a plan. A plan to remove and relocate them. That was the phrase she used, carefully chosen, because it sounds reasonable, harmless even. Until you think about what it actually means. You don't just relocate wildlife because you don't like it. Not legally, not easily. And definitely not because it doesn't match your idea of how a neighborhood should look, but that didn't seem to matter, because by the third email, it was clear she wasn't asking. She was announcing. Effective immediately, feeding the ducks was prohibited. Approaching them was discouraged, and measures would be taken to address the situation. Measures. That word again. Vague enough to sound official, specific enough to sound intentional. That's when people started paying attention. Not because of the ducks, but because of her. Because when someone starts trying to control something that doesn't belong to them, it usually doesn't stop there. I saw her at the pond later that week, standing near the edge, arms crossed, watching the ducks like they were personally responsible for something. They didn't react, didn't move away, just kept doing what ducks do, floating, dipping their heads, moving in slow, calm patterns across the water, completely unaffected by whatever she thought she was going to do about them. That contrast was almost funny, because she looked like she was preparing for a problem, and they looked like they didn't even know one existed. A couple of neighbors were nearby, watching from a distance, not interfering, just observing, because something about the situation felt off. You don't usually see someone treating a group of ducks like a conflict, but that's exactly what it was becoming. Over the next few days, things escalated. Not dramatically, but consistently. Small signs at first, literal signs, posted around the pond. Do not feed wildlife. Keep distance. HOA notice. Restricted area. Restricted. At a pond. In an open neighborhood. That's when people started asking questions. Not loudly, not publicly, just quietly. Between each other. Because rules only make sense when they're connected to something real. And this didn't feel real. It felt forced. And then the next step happened. Barriers, temporary, light, but noticeable, placed along one side of the pond, like someone was trying to guide movement, control access, shape behavior. The ducks ignored them. Of course they did, because they're ducks. They don't read signs. They don't follow boundaries that don't exist to them. They just moved around them, through them, over them, completely unaffected. That's when it became clear. This wasn't going to work. Not the way she thought it would. Because she wasn't dealing with people. She was dealing with something that didn't respond to authority, didn't recognize rules, and didn't care about control, and that's a problem. When control is the only thing you know how to use. A week later, another notice went out. Stronger language, more urgency, mentioning next steps. That's when I knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because people like her don't back off when something doesn't work. They push harder. Try more. Escalate. And the ducks were still just floating there, completely unaware that someone had just declared a war they were never going to lose. The first real attempt to solve the duck problem came quietly. No announcement, no email. Just a change. One morning, the pond looked different. Not dramatically, but enough. There were reflective strips tied along the edges of the water, thin pieces of material that caught the light and moved slightly with the wind. The kind of thing people use to discourage birds from settling in one place. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't harmful, it was just unnecessary. Because the ducks didn't care. They swam right past them like they weren't even there. Didn't avoid them, didn't react, didn't even acknowledge them. That should have been the end of it. A small test, a failed attempt, a signal to move on, but it wasn't. Because she didn't see it as failure, she saw it as resistance. And resistance is something people like her try to overcome. By the second week, the pond had turned into something else entirely. Not a natural space anymore. A project. More additions, more effort. Small floating deterrents appeared on the water, spaced out like someone had tried to redesign the environment without understanding how it worked. The ducks adjusted. Not because they had to, but because they could. They shifted slightly, changed direction, then settled right back into the same patterns they always had. Calm, unbothered, completely unaffected. Meanwhile, the neighborhood started noticing more. People walking by would stop now, not to look at the ducks, but to look at what was being done around them. Because it didn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense, people start questioning it. That's when the comments started. Not directly to her, not at first, just conversations between neighbors. Is this really necessary? Who approved this? Why are we doing this to a pond? Simple questions. The kind that don't have good answers. She ignored them. Of course she did, because in her mind she wasn't doing something questionable. She was fixing a problem, even if the problem wasn't real. The next step came faster, too fast, like she had already decided what needed to happen before the previous attempts had even been tested. Temporary netting appeared along one side of the pond, low, loose, more symbolic than functional, but visible, very visible. And that changed things. Not for the ducks, for the people. Because now it didn't look like a solution. It looked like interference, something being imposed where it didn't belong. The ducks walked around it, literally, stepped over parts of it, slipped through gaps, went into the water from the other side like nothing had changed. It would have been funny if it wasn't so deliberate. Every effort she made just didn't land. And the more it didn't land, the more obvious it became. By the third week, the situation had shifted completely. It wasn't about ducks anymore. It was about her, about how far she was willing to go to enforce something no one had asked for. She started showing up at the pond more often, checking things, adjusting placements, watching, always watching. Like she was waiting for a moment where it finally worked. But it never did, because the environment wasn't responding the way she expected. And more importantly, neither were the people. One afternoon, I saw a small group gathered near the pond. Not protesting, not arguing, just standing there, talking. Looking at the setup, looking at the ducks, and then looking at each other. That kind of shared confusion doesn't need a leader. It builds on its own. Because once enough people see the same thing, they start reaching the same conclusion. This doesn't make sense. The ducks were still there. All 14 of them. Same number, same behavior, same calm presence. Like none of this had anything to do with them. Which in a way, it didn't. Because they weren't part of the conflict. They were just existing. The conflict was entirely one-sided, and that's what made it unstable, because you can't win something that the other side isn't even participating in. The turning point came a few days later, another email. But this one felt different, less confident, more defensive. She mentioned ongoing challenges and community feedback. Feedback. That word only shows up when people start pushing back, not aggressively, but enough. Enough to be noticed. Enough to matter. She tried to frame it as progress, as steps being taken, as control being established. But the reality was visible, right there at the pond. 14 ducks, unmoved, unchanged, completely untouched by everything she had done, and now, everyone else could see it too. That's when the situation stopped being private, stopped being internal, stopped being something she could manage quietly. Because once something becomes visible to everyone, it stops being yours to control. And at that point, it's only a matter of time before it ends. Not because someone forces it to, but because it can't continue the way it has been. The ducks didn't change. They didn't need to. Everything else was about to. By the start of the fourth week, the pond didn't feel like a problem anymore. It felt like proof, not of what she had been saying, but of what everyone else had started to realize. Because despite everything that had been added, adjusted, and enforced around it, the ducks were still there. All 14 of them. Same place, same patterns, same calm presence that had never changed from the beginning. And that consistency mattered, because it highlighted something no one could ignore anymore. Nothing she had done had worked. Not partially, not temporarily, not even by accident. It had all just failed, quietly, repeatedly. And now it was visible, not just to a few people, to everyone. The barriers were still there, the strips, the netting, all of it sitting around the pond like reminders of an idea that didn't hold up, and the longer they stayed, the more obvious that became. People started avoiding that area, not because of the ducks, but because of how unnatural it looked. Forced, out of place, like something had been added that didn't belong. And that's when the complaints started shifting. Not about wildlife, about the HOA. Emails began circulating, not aggressive, not confrontational, just clear. Residents asking why changes were being made to a shared natural space without proper discussion, why something that had never been an issue was suddenly being treated like one, and most importantly, why it wasn't working. Those questions mattered because they didn't come from one person, they came from multiple directions, independently, which meant they couldn't be ignored the same way individual concerns can. The next HOA meeting was fuller than usual, not packed, but noticeably different. More people, more attention, more focus. She was there, of course, sitting at the front again, same position, but not the same presence, because confidence looks different when it's supported and when it's not. When the discussion opened, the topic came up almost immediately, not as an attack, not as a confrontation, just as a question. Can we talk about the pond? That was all it took, because once something is brought into the open, it has to be addressed. She responded the way she always did, structured, controlled, talking about efforts, solutions, and progress. But this time, it didn't land the same way, because now there was something else in the room. Evidence, not documents, not reports, just reality. Everyone had seen it. Everyone knew what the pond looked like now, and more importantly, what it looked like before. One of the residents spoke up. Have any of these measures actually changed anything? They asked. Simple question. No emotion, no accusation, just clarity. She paused, only briefly, but it was enough, because there wasn't a real answer to that, not one that matched what people had experienced. They've reduced impact, she said. But even as she said it, it didn't hold, because no one had seen any reduction. The ducks were still there, all 14, exactly the same. Another voice. Then why does it look worse now than it did before? That one shifted the room, because it wasn't about the ducks anymore. It was about the result, and the result was obvious. More interference, less natural space, no actual change. At that point, the conversation stopped being about defending actions and started being about correcting them, not aggressively, not emotionally, just logically, piece by piece, point by point, until there wasn't much left to defend. The decision came quickly after that. Not dramatic, not drawn out, just clear. All added measures would be removed, the pond would be returned to its original state, and any future actions involving shared spaces would require full community discussion. That was it. No argument, no resistance, because there wasn't anything left to push against. Once something is clearly not working, continuing, it doesn't make sense anymore. The changes started the next day. The strips came down first, then the netting, then everything else, one by one, until the pond looked the way it had before any of this started, natural, open, unrestricted. And the ducks? They never moved. They didn't need to. They had never been part of the problem. They had just been there, consistent, unaffected, unchanged. A few days later, the neighborhood felt normal again. People walked by the pond without stopping to question anything. Kids pointed at the ducks. Someone tossed a bit of bread despite the old signs that were no longer there. Life just continued, like it always had. I saw her once more after that, near the same area, walking past, no stopping, no checking, no adjustments, just movement, quiet, uninvolved. And that told me everything, because the person who had tried to control something that didn't belong to her was no longer trying. Not because she had decided to stop, but because the situation had made that decision for her. In the end, there was no dramatic moment, no confrontation, no final argument, just a slow shift back to reality, where the only thing that had actually worked was doing nothing at all. And the ducks? They never knew any of it happened. They just stayed exactly where they were, which is probably why they won. How did you like the story? Please like, share, and subscribe my YouTube channel for more HOA interesting stories.